Every killer was once a child. That's not just a chilling thought. It's a fact. Before the headlines, before the mugshots, before the horror, they were just little boys and girls, riding bikes, drawing with crayons, looking out the window of their bedrooms. But something went wrong. Not always in a dramatic Hollywood-style way. Not every future killer was beaten daily or screamed at every night. Sometimes the damage came in quiet moments, in cold stares, in the absence of love. And that's where the darkness begins. Not with violence, but with neglect, with silence, with emotional starvation. Psychologists have long warned us, the early years of life are not just important, they're critical. This is when a child learns what love looks like, what safety feels like, and how to connect with the world. If a child grows up feeling unseen, unheard, unloved, they don't just get sad. Their brain actually rewires itself. Think about that. Rewires itself. What we call empathy, the ability to feel for another person, is not just natural. It's taught. It's modeled. If a child doesn't receive affection, they don't develop the same emotional tools as others. The result? A human being who may look perfectly normal on the outside, but feels nothing on the inside. Take, for example, the infamous psychologist Dr. Kent Keel, who studied hundreds of inmates, many of them serial killers. He found that a shocking number had suffered severe neglect or trauma before the age of 6. 6. That's kindergarten. That's story time and juice boxes. And for some, it was already too late. Now, let's be clear. Not every child who goes through trauma becomes a killer. Most don't. But every serial killer studied has shown some form of early developmental trauma, emotional void, or deeply dysfunctional parenting. There's a pattern, a haunting, undeniable pattern. And the scariest part? Most of their parents had no idea what they were creating. The damage wasn't always physical. In many cases, it was emotional. Parents, too, caught up in their own pain. Too rigid, too cold, or too absent entirely. A child left to navigate the terrifying complexity of human emotions without a map. So the question isn't just, how did they kill? The question is, who failed them first? In this video, we're peeling back the curtain, not to excuse these monsters, but to understand them, to trace the blood back to the beginning. Because if we can understand how a monster is made, maybe, just maybe, we can stop the next one before they're born. Stick with us. What you'll hear next might change the way you think about parenting, childhood, and the true roots of evil. We hear their names and feel instant dread. Bundy, Dahmer, Kemper, Warnos. But before they were monsters, they were children. Some were even described as polite, quiet, or gifted. But beneath the surface was a storm brewing, the result of years of emotional wounds left untreated. Let's start with Jeffrey Dahmer. Known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, his crimes shocked the world. But his path to darkness began early. Dahmer's parents were constantly fighting. His father was emotionally distant, and his mother suffered from mental illness and frequent breakdowns. By the time Jeffrey was a teen, he was utterly isolated, withdrawn, emotionless, and obsessed with control. No one stepped in. No one asked the hard questions. Then there's Ted Bundy, the charming, educated killer who hid behind a smile. As a child, Bundy was told that his mother was his sister, and his grandparents were his real parents. He was raised in a house built on lies. His grandfather was abusive, and Bundy reportedly witnessed disturbing behavior from a young age. That instability created deep confusion about identity and morality, the perfect breeding ground for manipulation and detachment. Edmund Kemper, the 6'9" co-ed killer, was forced to live in his mother's basement as a boy. His mother was cruel, demeaning, and emotionally abusive, constantly belittling him, telling him he'd never be loved. She taught him to hate women. Kemper later admitted that every victim he killed was, in his mind, a stand-in for her. His rage didn't come from nowhere. It came from home. And then there's Eileen Wuornos, often portrayed as a lone, violent woman on the margins of society. But her story is steeped in pain. Abandoned by her mother, abused by her grandfather, and living on the streets as a teen, Eileen never had a real childhood. By the time she was arrested for murder, she was already broken by years of exploitation and neglect. Society didn't just fail her, it never gave her a chance. These stories aren't just tragic, they're revealing. What links them isn't just violence, but early emotional chaos. Disconnection, abuse, neglect, lies. It's easy to label these people as monsters, but the real horror might be how many red flags were ignored, how many chances were missed to intervene. Because here's the truth no one wants to say out loud. Monsters aren't born in the woods or summoned from nightmares. They're raised. They grow right next to us, in our homes, in our schools, in our neighborhoods. And while we may not be able to predict every killer, we can see the signs, if we're willing to look. Nobody wants to believe their child is capable of evil, and most aren't. But there are signs, small, subtle, unsettling, that many parents either miss or refuse to see. These aren't just tantrums or teenage mood swings. These are deeper cracks in the emotional foundation of a child. Signs that something is broken or never fully formed to begin with. One of the earliest and most common patterns? A complete lack of empathy. You see it when a child hurts a pet and feels nothing. When they laugh at another's pain. When they lie without remorse. Not to avoid punishment, but because it gives them control. Cruelty to animals is one of the most consistent early behaviors linked to future violent offenders. It's not about curiosity, it's about domination, power. And when it's ignored, it festers into something far more dangerous. Then there's fire setting, another disturbing but often overlooked behavior. Some kids light fires out of boredom, others out of something darker. The destruction excites them. It makes them feel alive. It gives them a sense of control over something, anything, in a world where they often feel powerless. And then there's emotional coldness. A child who doesn't cry when others are hurt. One who doesn't form real attachments. Who mimics affection instead of feeling it. These kids can be charming, even manipulative, but it's surface level. There's no depth to the feeling, no true connection. And this emotional detachment is often mistaken for independence or maturity. Parents might say, "Oh, he's just quiet," or "she's just shy." But sometimes it's not shyness, it's a lack of bonding. A child who has learned that emotions are either unsafe or simply unnecessary. Bedwetting, isolation, aggressive fantasies, obsessions with death or control, these are all signs that something isn't right. And yet, many parents dismiss them. Why? Because it's painful. Because it's easier to believe it's a phase than to face the possibility that your child is struggling deeply. But ignoring the signs doesn't make them go away. It just gives them time to evolve into something worse. It's important to note, these signs don't always lead to violence. Many children who struggle with empathy or emotional regulation grow into healthy adults with the right support. The difference often comes down to whether someone noticed and cared enough to act. Because every future killer, at one point, was a child begging for control, for power, for attention, for someone to finally see them. Not all broken children come from broken homes. Sometimes the house is spotless. The fridge is full. The parents are kind. And yet, the child still slips into the dark. That's the terrifying part. It's easy to blame bad parenting when things go horribly wrong. But what if the parents were trying their best? What if their love though real, was misguided. Take the overprotective parent, the one who shields their child from failure, pain, or even consequences. It may seem harmless, even loving, but it can lead to something dangerous. A child who never learns accountability, who grows up believing the world owes them comfort, who confuses control with safety and lashes out when life doesn't bend to their will. Then there's the emotionally distant parent, not cruel, but absent. Maybe they work long hours. Maybe they just don't know how to connect. The child is fed, clothed, and cared for, but emotionally starved. They grow up feeling unseen, and in some cases, that emptiness becomes anger, resentment, a silent, burning rage that festers over time. And what about the perfectionist parent? The one who demands straight A's, perfect behavior, constant achievement. Their child becomes a performance piece, loved only when they succeed. Failure is punished, vulnerability is weakness, and mistakes are not allowed. Over time, that child learns to bury emotions, wear a mask, and do whatever it takes to maintain control, even if it means manipulating or hurting others to stay in power. These parenting styles don't come from hate. They come from fear. Fear of the world, fear of failure, fear of repeating their own childhood trauma. But fear-driven parenting creates fear-driven children. Children are mirrors. They reflect what they're shown. And if what they see is conditional love, emotional distance, or constant pressure, they may grow up without the tools to feel deeply, love fully, or understand right from wrong. This doesn't mean parents are always to blame, but it does mean their influence is more powerful than they realize. Sometimes it's not the presence of pain that creates a killer. It's the absence of emotional connection, the kind that teaches empathy, resilience, and humanity. In the eyes of the world, these children looked fine. They smiled in school photos. They did their chores. They said please and thank you. But inside they were unraveling, and no one noticed until it was too late. So if you're asking, how could a parent let this happen? Sometimes the answer is brutal. They didn't even know it was happening at all. It doesn't happen overnight. No one just wakes up and decides to become a monster. It starts slow, invisible even, like a shadow that stretches further each day. The mind of a future killer doesn't form in one moment. It evolves, built from small compounding experiences: humiliation, rejection, emotional neglect, suppressed rage, or a lifetime of being misunderstood. Over time, the pain doesn't fade. It hardens. It becomes identity. Psychologists call it cognitive distortion. That's when the brain starts misinterpreting the world, seeing threats where there are none, enemies in every stranger, betrayal in every relationship. To the outside world, the person seems off. To themselves, they're just surviving a hostile world. One common trait is paranoia, not the tinfoil hat kind, but subtle, insidious distrust. These individuals believe everyone is out to get them. Every glance, every word is an attack. Over time, they build narratives to justify their pain, and sometimes their violence. Then comes narcissism or grandiosity. It may seem contradictory, but many killers feel both worthless and superior. It's a defense mechanism, a way to cover deep-rooted insecurity. They don't just want to be seen, they want to dominate, to prove they matter. And if they can't be loved, they'll settle for being feared. The final, most dangerous stage? Desensitization. The point where the line between right and wrong no longer exists. Where empathy is gone and other people are seen as objects, tools, obstacles, or targets. This is when the fantasies begin, when control becomes obsession, when the thought of violence doesn't feel wrong anymore. It feels necessary. And the scariest part? Sometimes they hide it perfectly. Many of history's most notorious killers were described as quiet, even polite. They had jobs, friends, families, because by the time their mind had fully evolved into something dark, they'd also learned how to wear a mask, one that hid their rage, until the moment they decided to act. Inside, though, their world was warped. Emotions became weakness, control became survival. And violence? Violence became the only language they trusted. But make no mistake, this transformation doesn't happen in a vacuum. It starts with what they don't get as children: love, stability, connection. And it grows in the dark spaces where pain is buried, not healed. So the next time someone says, "He just snapped," remember, that's rarely true. He didn't snap. He transformed. Over years. Slowly. Quietly. While the world wasn't watching. If monsters are made, can we unmake them? Can we break the cycle before it begins? The answer is complex. But it starts with one simple truth. Most children who show early signs of emotional disturbance don't become killers. The difference lies in what happens next, whether they're ignored or seen, abandoned or helped. Breaking the cycle isn't about punishing bad behavior, it's about understanding what's driving it. That child who lashes out violently, maybe they're not cruel, maybe they're hurting. That kid who bullies others, maybe they've never felt powerful in their own life. That teen who shows no emotion, maybe they've learned that feelings only bring pain. Early intervention is everything. Therapy, safe environments, consistent support. These tools work, but only if we recognize the warning signs for what they are. Cries for help, not just bad behavior. Parents play a major role, but so do teachers, doctors, neighbors, and even peers. A single adult who listens, believes, and shows consistent care can make a life-changing difference. Empathy is teachable. So is self-regulation. So is emotional awareness. But only if we stop treating these issues like dirty secrets and start treating them like health problems that deserve attention, not shame. And what about the kids already deep in that darkness? The ones who've withdrawn, who've given up, who fantasize about revenge? For them, it might feel too late. But even then, it's not. There are programs designed to rehabilitate, not just punish, to understand, not just judge. And some do find their way back when someone shows them it's possible. The truth is, no child dreams of becoming a killer. They dream of being loved, protected, seen. It's the world that sometimes teaches them the opposite. So yes, the cycle can be stopped, but only if we're willing to face it head-on, to look past the mask, to ask the hard questions, and to give as much attention to emotional wounds as we do to physical ones. Because in the end, we're not just talking about crime. We're talking about human potential, about the lives that could be saved, not just from death, but from darkness. If this series has made you uncomfortable, good. That means it made you feel. That means it did its job. And if you're wondering what to do with this information now, the answer is simple. Start watching. Start listening. Start asking questions. The next child who needs help might not ask for it, but you might still be the one who notices. Because sometimes, the difference between a monster and a miracle is simply whether someone showed up in time. Monsters aren't born. They're built, slowly, quietly, in the shadows of homes, schools, and hearts that fail to heal. But if we shine a light early enough, maybe, just maybe, we can stop the making of a killer. You've just watched a deep dive into the unseen roots of violence, how trauma, neglect, and misguided parenting can unknowingly create chaos that echoes for generations. If this story opened your eyes, imagine how many others still need to hear it. Subscribe for more psychological true crime stories that go beyond the headlines. Like this video if it challenged your thinking. Comment your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed these warning signs? And please, share this with someone who works with kids, who's raising one, or who was once that angry, unheard child themselves. Because awareness isn't just power, it's prevention. Until next time, stay aware, stay safe, and never stop asking the hard questions.